I'm Patrick Byers, Horticulture Field Specialist with the University of Missouri Extension. Thank you for joining us for our video series, Practical Advice from Successful Farmers. The subject of this video is sweet potato slip production. Why would a farmer consider growing their own slips? Well, the first consideration might be availability. For example, there are some heritage cultivars of sweet potatoes that have only a limited supply of slips from commercial nurseries, and it might be advantageous for the farmer to grow their own slips from those particular cultivars. In some years, the sources of commercially available slips have been in short supply. In that case, having an on-farm source of slips might make sense. If a farmer is interested in organically grown slips, there may be some situations where it's better for the farmer to grow their own slips as well. And then finally, quality. Slips that are grown on-farm and immediately transplanted into production fields take off well, they establish well, and result in good, vigorous growth, whereas slips that are purchased from a commercial source may arrive in less than optimum condition. The next thing to consider is how many sweet potatoes are needed for a farm's purposes from the standpoint of the number of slips needed to plant the plantings on the farm. A bushel of seed sweet potatoes, then treated properly and grown into slips, will typically yield somewhere between 2,000 to 2,500 slips. What this means that in typical spacings for sweet potatoes, 4 to 6 bushel of seed sweet potatoes will produce enough slips to plant an acre of sweet potatoes. Now let's think about a good place to start slips. The first step in growing slips on farm is to have a good source of stock or seed potatoes. Now these can be saved from the previous season's harvest, or they can be purchased each year. If they're purchased, make sure that they come from foundation stock so that the resulting slips will produce plants that are as free from viruses and other issues as possible. If saving sweet potatoes from the previous season's harvest, it's very important to pay attention to quality of the seed potatoes. Good seed potatoes typically are medium in size, somewhere between 1 to 3 inches in diameter. When they're harvested, they should be treated very carefully to avoid any damage to the potatoes. They should be cured and stored carefully, and they should be examined carefully when they're brought out of storage, preparatory to producing the slips. In other words, good quality seed potatoes result in good quality slips. Let's think about a good place to grow sweet potato slips. Sweet potatoes, of course, are warm season vegetables, and for slip production, it's important that the environment in which the potatoes are placed is warm enough to foster growth. Typically, sweet potato slips will be started sometime fairly early in the spring, perhaps as early as March. And it's important to have a spot in place where you can maintain warm conditions. Now, it's certainly possible to place heating cables or otherwise warm the soil, but frequently farmers will consider a site in some sort of protected environment, such as inside of a high tunnel, perhaps in a cold frame or some other protected structure where the warmth necessary for slip production can be maintained. A raised bed is a good spot to grow sweet potato slips. Very important to ensure that the area in which they're being grown is well drained, so hence the value of a raised bed. Farmers should consider pre-sprouting the seed potatoes before starting the process of producing the slips. Pre-sprouting is done at warm temperatures, typically 75 to 85 degrees, and at high relative humidity. 85 to 90% works well. The pre-sprouting process will take 2 to 4 weeks, and the process is complete when the small sprouts on the seed potatoes are about 1/4 inch in length. At this point, the seed potatoes can be placed on the beds. The process of producing slips from start to finish typically takes somewhere between 5 to 8 weeks. Now, why the wide range? Well, it all depends upon the temperature conditions in the slip bed. The warmer the conditions, the more quickly slip production will commence. Pre-sprouted potatoes will also produce slips more quickly. A bushel of sweet potatoes will require roughly 12 square feet when spread out. Try not to have the potatoes piled up, and try to separate them just a little bit as you place them on the bed. As you place the sweet potatoes on the bed, examine them carefully. Discard any that show signs of rot, that are broken, or that show any other abnormalities. Once the sweet potatoes are spread on the bed, then place a layer of fine soil or perhaps a material such as sifted compost about 2 inches over the top of the seed potatoes. Some farmers will consider putting a layer of chicken wire over the top of the beds. Again, this helps hold the potatoes in place as the slips are removed and also protects them to some degree from rodents such as voles. Once the seed potatoes are in place on the beds and covered with either soil or compost, place a plastic mulch over the top of the bed. Now this mulch should be in close contact with the soil, and this will help maintain the warm temperatures necessary for slip production. Best temperatures for slip production are somewhere between 75 and 85 degrees. Cooler soils will result in slower slip production, so try to maintain warm temperatures to maintain good, vigorous slip production. Farmers sometimes fertilize the bed before placing the seed potatoes. Typically, a small amount of a nitrogen-containing fertilizer can be placed in the beds prior to placing the seed potatoes. It's also very important to keep the beds moist. Once the beds are in place, moisten them before placing the plastic mulch, and consider a drip or a trickle line underneath the plastic mulch to help provide moisture if needed, obviously to encourage slip production. Once the bed is in place with the plastic mulch, consider placing a floating row cover or some other type of material over the top of the bed to further maintain warm temperatures. Again, these slips have been placed during the cooler part of the spring, and maintaining warm temperatures will help foster slip production. Keep an eye on the sweet potato seed beds. As the seed potatoes produce slips, and the slips emerge above the surface of the soil or the compost, they'll begin to push up the plastic. And this is a clue that it's time to remove that plastic mulch that is placed right over the bed. So at this point, slit the plastic, pull it down, and this will allow the slips then to grow. The slips will grow at different rates. In early slips, mid-season slips, and a little bit later slips, you can expect to harvest slips over about a 4-week period from start to finish. As the slips grow, it can be helpful to cut the tips off of the more vigorous early slips, again to maintain a more uniform production of slips from the standpoint of planting. This can be done by hand, or it can also be done with a string trimmer. Once the slips reach about 6 to 8 inches, cut the very tips off with the string trimmer or by hand. Slips are ready to harvest when they have 4 to 6 leaves on. Harvest slips by cutting them just above the surface of the compost or the soil in the bed. By cutting the slip at this point, you reduce the risk of transmitting diseases that might be present in the soil or in the compost when the slips are then taken to the production fields. Cut slips early in the day. Best to cut them before 10 o'clock while temperatures are still cool and the slips are very turgid and full of moisture. Bundle the slips as they're cut and immediately place them in an area that is out of the sun, cool, and moist. A good place to place cut slips might be inside of a cooler, again where they can be protected from warm temperatures. Once the slips are harvested, it's important to plant them as soon as possible. They can be held for short periods of time, but in an ideal situation, the slips will be planted as they are harvested. Water the slips immediately after they are planted, and keep a close eye on watering for at least the first 2 weeks. They may need to be watered daily during periods of warm temperatures, but the slips should root well and produce a good quality planting bed of sweet potatoes. Thank you for joining us for this video on sweet potato slip production. For more information on sweet potato production or other specialty crops, visit the webcityfarmersmarket.com website. This project was made possible in part with generous funding from the Missouri Department of Agriculture Specialty Crop Block Grant Program and is a joint project of University of Missouri Extension, Lincoln University Cooperative Extension, and the Web City Farmers Market.